In an effort to reset my attention span, I'm going to read 100 books this year. And each month, I'm going to give you an update on the books that I read, whether or not I'd recommend them, whether or not they're any good at all. And hopefully that will keep me on track so that I meet my goal of 100 books. So without any further ado, let's talk about January's books. And I've tried to group them in some coherent form, but forgive me, I read 13 books in January. Did I? Maybe I read 12. I don't even remember. I have the list written down right here. 12 books. Don't want to cheat myself. So we'll start with 2 books that are in the middle of series that I have a hard time recommending because they are in the middle of a series and it's kind of a long commitment. The first of those books is Ghost Story, which is a Dresden Files book. I think it's the 13th. Let me check my notes once again. That's what I'm doing if I'm looking down here. Can't get a teleprompter because I'm not that professional. It is the 13th of, I believe, 18 books. And let me tell you something, I am dragging with this series. Started reading this series in college. That was 10 years ago. And I've been in and out of this series for a long time. It is, a little bit more modern fantasy. It's not so much high fantasy. It's tough. The first couple of books, Dresden's not a very likable character. He's a wizard in Chicago, etc. I'm not going to give you a whole plot synopsis of the whole series. Needless to say, didn't love this book. Gave it a 3 out of 5 just because I think that's just my default. If I made it through and the writing was decent, I gave it a 3 out of 5. Probably a 2.5 out of 5 if I had to really, nail down the nitty gritty. It's hard for me to continue reading this series, but I've committed to it. So at this point, it seems like I'm going to keep going until I catch up with it. But that was a book that I read in January that I probably don't recommend. Second up, and finally in the long series that I can't really recommend, but if you're looking for a long series, maybe go for it, is Reaper, which is book number 10 in the Cradle series. This one's only 12 books, and they're a little bit shorter. So if you're looking for something to take up your time, you can go ahead and check this out. I think I've actually gained momentum as I've continued reading these books. The first couple, I'm not going to say they're a slog. They're still decently entertaining, but there's not a lot of character. There's not a lot of, external subplots. There's more so just, here's the main character. This is the trajectory they're on. This is where we're going, which is fine. But when you're talking about the fantasy genre, which I think this falls into, it's loose fantasy. There's a magic system. There's a very interesting world building as the series goes on. So I'm going to say fantasy. When you're talking about the fantasy genre and you're going up against titans, like, Brandon Sanderson's work or George R.R. Martin with the world building, it's really tough when your first book is 350 pages and it's just, here's this person's quest and they're going on it and you don't really get many details. But as the series goes on, and this is the 10th book, it really starts to shine. I really think that I was close to dropping it around like book 3, and I'm really glad that I kept it going. So if you are a fan of anime, if you're a fan of power scaling, anything like that, I would recommend giving Cradle a try. They're very short. I recommend listening to them on Audible. That's what I do. I do a lot of audiobook listening. If you watch a lot of these videos, you're going to, start to realize that. But I think that the narrator, Travis Baldree, who is an author himself, he just does such a great job. Like some of the best voice acting, really cool takes on all the characters' voices. And, I can't think about a character without hearing his voice too. So if you're looking for something a little bit lighter, but still a lot of fun and a little bit of depth to it, I would go for this series. All right, moving on. A couple books I couldn't fit into a category. Sorry, it's not always going to be nice and neat. First up is The Philosopher's Toolkit. Does it count as a book? Not 100% sure because it is part of the Audible Great Classes series, which is basically just a lecture series. I try and do one of these a month just to, get the feeling of being in college again. But there's a lot of topics that interest me that, I don't really want to commit to a full long text reading. Instead, I want to kind of just get, the bullet points. So interested in philosophy. The Philosopher's Toolkit didn't really hit for me. It was a 2 out of 5. It was just a little bit too surface level, if that makes sense. A lot of the concepts I had come across already in other reading, and I was looking to go a little bit deeper. Maybe I needed a 102 instead of a 101, but I digress. If you are really basic and really, just starting out your journey in philosophy, I think this is a good class. It was well taught. It was well structured, but it was just kind of boring for me because I was already so familiar with a lot of the concepts. Another in the miscellaneous category is A Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich. Yes, very Russian. I really enjoyed this. It helped that I was reading this while I was very ill and had a fever. And there's nothing like reading about someone else's struggles to kind of help you get over your own. I've read a lot of self-help in the past, and a lot of the self-help books kind of start to just all drone together. But I think it's really interesting to look at fiction as a way to also work towards self-improvement or self-help or just changing your mindset. And I think reading about someone who was in the Gulag, who was in Siberia basically during World War II, and one day in their life and the hardship that they have to go through, really does help put your modern life in perspective. And if you're watching this video on YouTube, most likely you are not experiencing the same hardships that 1944 Russia had to offer, the USSR, I guess at that point. Really interesting, well written, pretty short. If you're looking to just kind of bang something out over a weekend, I recommend it. It is Russian, so you know, you're not gonna have great feelings coming out of it. Just a little disclaimer. Next up, we have The Mercy of Gods, which is by James S.A. Corey, which is a duo. You may know them from The Expanse of Amazon fame. They adapted that novel series into a TV show, which I thought was pretty decent. I was a big fan of The Expanse. I really enjoyed it. I picked it up right as it started, you know, and once again, one of those that I listened to, and the same narrator narrates this book, which is great. It's like coming home to a warm hug. But I will say, this book is clearly trying to diverge, I think, from The Expanse, trying to get a little bit more into the harder sci-fi. There's a lot more biology. There's a lot more, you know, world building in terms of planetary evolution, which I think is interesting. Not really what I'm looking for when I come to the sci-fi genre. I know a lot of people love the harder sci-fi stuff, but for me, I just want kind of like space cowboys. But that's not to say that I didn't enjoy this book. It felt like a lot of setup for the next two books in the series because it is planned to be a trilogy. It's really well written. These two really know how to write, man. Like it's solid. You know, the plot is incredible. The prose is great. I will say there's not as much character as you get with The Expanse. That may change. Obviously, it's the first book in a trilogy, but I felt like with The Expanse, even from book one, I was more connected to the characters than I was in The Mercy of Gods. It's a really interesting story and a really interesting world, but if you're looking for character and if you're looking for more, you know, more of a contained story in a singular book, I don't know if this is going to be right for you. I think it's a 3 out of 5, on the upper end of a 3, maybe a 3.5, because it is just so well written, but I was kind of looking for a little bit more. Maybe I'm still clinging to The Expanse and I need to give this trilogy some time to kind of flesh out a little bit, but that's where I'm at right now. Still in the miscellaneous category, let's talk about The Old Man and the Sea, which is an Ernest Hemingway novella, actually. It's only like 140 pages. I'm a big Hemingway fan. Sun Also Rises, one of my favorite books of all time. This is not The Sun Also Rises. This is it's a novella. I think it's very polarizing, especially modern readers and commentary-ists kind of go either way on this. I think there's an element to this book where it's kind of like, do you want to read deeply into the symbolism of, you know, the old man fighting against fish, man against nature, you know, the Christ figure, whatever. But there's also a Hemingway quote that's like, nah, it's just a story about an old guy and catching a fish. So, you know, does the author know what he's talking about when he's talking about symbolism? I don't know. Some people would say that you read symbolism into the text. Some people would say that the author's intent is important. I don't know where I fall on that. I thought it was a fine book. 3 out of 5. You know, that, stop me if you've heard that before. More so on the low end of 3 for me. It's short. You know, you can get through it really quick. But there's only so much that you can read about the harrowing tale of an old man trying to catch a marlin. You know, if you're a fisherman, you'll probably like this a lot more than I did. But the only time I've been fishing, deep sea fishing, I got super seasick on my 9th birthday, and I still haven't forgiven my dad about it. So, not really my cup of tea. I love Ernest Hemingway. I'm pretty much going to read everything that he's written. I've almost read all of it anyway, so it was next on the list. There you go. Finally, in the miscellaneous category, we have The Addiction Manifesto, which I came to thinking that it was going to be something that it wasn't. So I don't want to judge it more harshly than I should. I did give it a 2 out of 5. I thought it was a little bit raw for me. I think 4 years ago, when I was more so in the throes of active alcoholism, it probably would have hit a little bit harder for me. But now, you know, 4 years sober, out of the throes of active alcoholism, it didn't really have the same punch. I think that it is a good book to read if you want to understand a little bit more of the mindset of addicts. If you have someone in your life who is struggling with addiction, I think it's pretty solid, especially the testimonials at the end. But the writing is just so raw because the person writing it is not an author. They are an addict trying to tell their story. It's more of a memoir. It's more of a self-help. It's more of a motivational tool than it is a story. And I think that I came into it thinking that it was going to be written a little bit more solidly, for lack of a better word. It's very raw. That is good a lot of times when we're talking about addiction, because addiction is very raw. It is very real. And I think that it is portrayed very effectively in this book. I think it really shines, like I said, in the last chapter with the testimonials, reading about other people's stories. When I was going through my own struggles, understanding that there was a wide swath of people from all different socioeconomic, backgrounds dealing with addiction, understanding that addiction doesn't, discriminate. Addiction comes for us all. If you are, predisposed to it, that can help. And it helped me. So I don't want to say that this is a do not read. I think it's solid. It's short enough that you can get something out of it without feeling like you're wasting your time, especially if you really don't have any experience and you want to help someone in your life. I think it's valuable to understand what they may be going through. Okay, we have reached the largest category, which is the history category. Spoiler alert, I am a history major. I was a history major. I've been talking about college a lot in this video. I studied history. I studied Latin American and Asian history in college. I'm a big history fan, so I have found myself reading a lot of history as I continue to grow. Coincidentally, I read 2 books about the Civil War in January, which was not on purpose. As someone who did not grow up in the United States, I didn't move to the United States until high school. I didn't go through the same rigorous, Civil War scholarship that all the middle schoolers always talk about in America. I know that it's kind of pounded into your guys' heads in middle school, so I missed out on a lot of that. So I figured try and backfill a lot of my my knowledge. And the first one that I started with was The Killer Angels, which I think is one of the better history fiction novels. It's hard for me to completely categorize it as a history text because it is written not so much by a scholar, more so by a journalist who did their research. Like, it's well sourced, but it is more so written in first person perspective. There's not your traditional history text, which is good, I think, because there's more than enough scholarship written on the Civil War in that vein. And I think this touched me personally more so because it is first person perspective by a lot of the major players in the Gettysburg battle. I think that, just reading a dry battle maps and, numbers on a page would not have had the same effect as this book did. And I think if you are fed up with kind of your classic history, X and Y moved here and there on this date and all that, give this a shot. If you are interested in that time period, even if you're not, I think it's so well written and so emotion driven that it's valuable even if you are not a history person. So I give this one a 4 out of 5. This was probably my favorite book of the month. So that's really cool. I was really not expecting it at all, but I think it's super valuable. So I would recommend it. Go ahead and give it a shot. The second Civil War book that I read is called The Demons of Unrest, written by the same author that did The Devil in the White City, Splendid and Vile. A good author that I really enjoy. This was not my favorite offering of his, maybe because I was already burnt out on the Civil War from the earlier book. You never know. But still, incredibly well written, incredibly well sourced. Erik Larson, I believe is his name, is a fantastic author and is really doing good work in terms of primary sources that are then being translated into a readable, digestible piece of work for other people outside of the history academia to absorb. It's incredibly readable, but does not sacrifice validity because of how primary source driven it is. It's taken directly from the pages of diaries written at the time, letters, correspondence. It's a really well written book. And this goes through the first year before the war begins, before, the attack on Fort Sumter. Really interesting perspectives from Lincoln, the leaders of Fort Sumter, the leaders of South Carolina militia. There were a couple perspectives that I didn't really love, like there was a debutante perspective that I felt didn't really offer that much to the text, but I think the Lincoln chapters are great. I think the chapters about the actual U.S. Army members in Fort Sumter waiting to see if they're going to get relieved or if they're going to be attacked by South Carolina militia is a really interesting thing. Again, getting first-person perspective can help kind of dust off some of the, textbook style Civil War stuff that we've been talking about forever if you went to American middle school and high school. So, I just think it's a really interesting way to reassess and kind of reinvigorate your knowledge for the time period. I think it's an important part of American history, and there's good scholarship still coming out about it. So give it a shot. You might like it. We move away from modern history to more ancient history with two books that I'm going to kind of talk to as foils. First up, A Fatal Thing Happened on the Way to the Forum is a book about murder in ancient Rome. I was so excited for this, and unfortunately, I did not love it. 2 out of 5. The style of it really did not work for me. And that doesn't mean that it was bad, but it just didn't work for me. I've talked a lot about the importance of scholarship in history textbooks, in history text in general. And I just felt like if you're going to talk about Reddit in a book about, ancient Rome, it's just not for me. I think that a lot of people will enjoy this book. I think the subject matter is really, really interesting. And it is well written. The style just did not work for me at all. It felt a little too flippant. It just wasn't for me. I think that you may find some really interesting tidbits. There's great information about how murder was looked at in ancient Rome, how it was judged. Again, I think the subject matter is incredibly interesting and it is laid out very well. The style is just tough for me to get into. But speaking of a more flip and a more kind of, easy style, the next book that I read was Troy, which is in Stephen Fry's Mythos series, which is not so much a retelling of ancient Greek myth, but more so like a modernization. So this is obviously taken heavily from the Iliad, talking about the Trojan War. And you may say, okay, you didn't love the flip or glib, whatever you want to say, tone in the Forum. Why did it work for you in Troy? I think because it's more centered on myth. It's not so much centered on actual historical fact. Maybe I just like the subject matter a little bit more. I don't know. These are just my thoughts while I'm reading the books. But I really did enjoy this one. I think it was a 3.5 out of 5. I really liked the other 2 offerings in this series. The value, I think, in Troy is more so that if you want to get into the Iliad or you read the Iliad in middle school and you didn't really get it, and you want to dive into the epic poem, but you don't want to deal with the dactylic hexameter, which I did look up. That's, the style of poem that Homer uses. This is a great way to kind of get your feet wet with all the characters. It's really well laid out. And then you can go back to the Iliad with a broader idea of what's actually going on so that you don't get caught up in the 10 pages talking about all the ships that left for Troy, which can be pretty tough, but it's an incredible piece of art. It's an incredible piece of writing. The Iliad I'm talking about, obviously. Troy is good, but it's not, classic. And I think it deserves its fair shake, and this is a good way to kind of get your feet wet with it and enter into an attempt at reading it. So I really like this. I thought it was really well written. Again, audiobook, Stephen Fry reads it, great voice, fantastic. The 12th and final book that I read in January is called Palestine, 1936. There's a subtitle. I don't want to say it's so long. I mean, I guess I could. I didn't even write it down. Palestine, 1936. 3.5 out of 5. I am so lacking in knowledge of modern history in the Middle East that this was a great entry point. We've been talking about scholarship a lot. This is so well sourced. It's written by a political commentator and a journalist. It is one of the fairest texts that I've ever read in terms of Middle Eastern history, which is very difficult to do because it is so fraught with emotion. It is so fraught with tragedy that it can be difficult to actually just tell the events without the author putting their own spin on things, which is the author's prerogative. But when I'm looking for a history text, most of the time I am looking for what happened, when it happened, who were the key players, all that stuff. And I think that this gives a great look at English-controlled Palestine, some of the choices that led up to some of the modern conflicts that is still raging in the region. Also a really interesting look at how the context of World War II Hitler's atrocities really affected this region. So I cannot recommend it enough. It's well written. It's very easy to follow along. I think it's great. So one of my favorites, 3.5 out of 5. Really good. Give it a shot. Okay, so that's 12 books. Like I said, I'm trying to read 100. So I'm going to try to read between 8 and 10 each month so that we can continue these videos. Thank you so much for watching. We've got a ton more content coming out on this channel. Really means a lot to me that you spent, 25 minutes watching me talk about books. I love books. I'm trying to fix my attention span. Hopefully you are trying to fix your attention span as well. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time.